Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Demai Pedig Vav. Today will be the final daf of Halacha Beis. We're going to be learning daf Nun Zayin. We left off on daf Nun Vav Amid Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. The Gemara is going to go back to a brisa that we already learned yesterday, and it's going to take it forward. The brisa that I'm referring to is Kohen Shemachar Sodel Yisrael. But when he sells in the field, as we mentioned, even though a kohen, like everyone else, is chayiv to separate trumas from maasros for his product, not to be tevel. But after the kohen separated trumas from what grew on his land, he can give it to himself. So you have a kohen that owns land that got truma from that land. He's selling the field. So we learned yesterday, and we're going to retake that brisa. We're going to go and quote that part and go further, that if a kohen sells his field to a Yisrael, but he tells the new buyer, the new landowner, I'm selling it to you on the condition that in the future, all of the maasros, meaning the trumas that you'll separate, you will give to me. Or better, they remain mine. Almanas, that the future maasros are mine. So the brisa says such a stipulation is effective. Now, what we have to explain is that halachically, one cannot affect a transaction on something that's not yet in the world. I know today people are very sophisticated, and you have the whole future market. The Torah introduced that. But you have to know how to do it, because simply to sell something that's not yet in the world is something ineffective, even if they made a kinyan. So how does it work? So we spoke out that it's assumed, it's as if the kohen retained some type of ownership in the land. The land is ba'olam. It's not davar shaloi b'la'olam, but it's not that he owns the land. He owns in the land the ownership in order for him to have the rights to the future trumos u'maasros. If a kohen were to say that explicitly, certainly that would be effective. The chiddush of the brisa is that even though the kohen didn't say it, since we're speaking about retention, it's assumed that that was the intent. It's assumed halachically that is also what the Yisrael, the new buyer, understood. Obviously, both parties have to be agreeing to the same condition with that nuance, and therefore it is effective. Now, what we're going to begin today is we're going to quote that brisa again, and we're going to clarify the meaning of that ownership. What exactly does it mean that the kohen is retaining ownership? I'll leave it to when we learn it, and said there's going to be a very nuanced, a very subtle, new understanding of what that ownership is all about. We're going to have many other cases where such stipulations were made. It's going to be a very interesting daf. We're going to, at some point, bring in a mishnah that we have in Ksubos, not related topic that the Gemara will relate, which is that if a man marries a woman prior to marriage, halachically you have to write a ksuba. And he did. And God forbid he divorced his wife. And he then decided to remarry her, which is 100% okay as long as she did not get married to someone else in the meanwhile. Right? Amram divorced Yocheved and he remarried Yocheved. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu came in. He was Machzor Gerushaso. But when he remarried her, he didn't write a nuksuba, which means that he remarried her with the understanding that he's binding himself with the first ksuba. To what extent is he bound by the original ksuba? The ksuba has 2 parts. There is the basic ksuba, 200 zuz to a psula, 100 zuz to a almana or a gerusha to a bu'ula. I'll explain that when we get later. But then people can add new stipulations in the ksuba that are not obligatory. If he wrote such optional obligations in ksuba number 1, and then again he divorces her and he gets remarried, he didn't rewrite anything. Is he binding himself only to the basics? Is he binding himself to all of the stipulations that were in the first? That will be linked to a very interesting, somehow similar topic in this sugya of selling land and retaining stuff like that. I just want to give a heads up that tomorrow, God willing, on Daf Nun Ches in Halacha Gimel, we're going to learn that when the kohen is the landowner and Yisrael is a mekabel, and we're going back to the Mishnah of Halacha Beis in the reverse, it's also presumed that the Mekabel the Yisrael is ceding, is giving, is agreeing to give all of the tithing privileges to the Kohen. What we're going to learn today is that the same is if the owner is a woman, a Kohenes, and we're going to conclude today's daf with the Gavaldi Kebraisa differentiating between a Kohen selling a field to a Yisrael and temporary retaining rights to Truma versus a Kohen selling a field to a Yisrael and retaining the rights of the Truma forever, which is the topic that we're beginning with. That will be a huge difference, as we will see. Okay, so without any further ado, Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Again, we're going back to the Braisa that we learned in yesterday's shir. And here you have a Kohen Shemachar Sadali Yisrael. And when he sells him the field, he tells him explicitly, Al Manas Sheyu HaMaisrei Shali, all of the future Maisres, meaning Trumais, and it can be Maisres also, as we keep on mentioning that Maisre Rishon could be given to a Kohen. So when a Kohen owns land, he separates the Truma Gedoyla, he separates Maisre Rishon, he separates the Trumas Maisre, and he can keep all of that for himself. So he tells the new buyer, the Yisrael landowner, in the future, it's all going to be mine. And as we learned, that stipulation is effective, HaMaisre Shaloi, because Nasik Ha'omer, it's as if he explicitly said that I am retaining a certain degree of ownership in the land. And Machal, that's necessary because you can't make a kinyan on a davar shaloi bala olam. Now, let's understand what that type of ownership is. Now we're continuing. Says the Braisa Meis, what happens if the Kohen, the original owner, the seller dies, and there's dinim of Yerusha? Whatever a person owns is automatically bequeathed to one's heirs. Nevertheless, his children have no ownership rights in the future Maisres. Now, why? So look, first of all, so the Manafulda says the words Eilaban of Klum. Why? Because the words that he said when he sold the field to the Yisrael, Al Manashi, you are Maisres, Shali, to me, Shali, Veloy Yarshai. To me and not to my heirs. I got that. But still understand something. You know, when a person passes away, even that which they don't have in their possession, if someone owes them money, that's called a ra'ui. It's also going to be going down the Yerusha, with the details that the Bechar doesn't have to Shnaim, only by Muhsek. But here we're seeing that the type of ownership is even less than ra'ui. You know, if he would mamish own the land, even though he would only own the land lemaisves, if he would own the land, of course the kids will have it. Who cares if he said, Lee, when you buy a house today, when you buy a house, you buy it Lee, you buy it for you. When the person passes away, it goes down to his heirs. I think that's a very big insight into the understanding of it's only enough ownership for him to be able to affect the kinyan on the future. The karkas bala. But it's not mamish his, because he only said li aber daf nun zayin amadala. But if he taka said befedish li ulabanai, or if he says li uli yarshai, and by the way, yarshai, you have heirs that are not only children, right? As we learned in Pedish, in Pedic Yeshnoichel and in Baba Basra, the whole Seder of Yerusha, right? It goes down and then it goes up. So then, if he said that, then indeed it will be effective for them as well. Not only does he have, but now, before we go on in the Braisa, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yudan Bar Shalom, when the person Taka said Leo Yarshai, and indeed you're telling me the Chiddush that it's effective, and that's a Chiddush because we already established that the ownership is an unusual type of ownership. It's even weaker than on the level of Ra'ui. Ad Kedoin, I know that. That's what the Braisa is saying. The Yarshim Shehem Midvar Torah. But what about Yarshim that are not Midvar Torah? Who knows of an example of a Yodesh that's only rabbinic? Even though what I'm saying now is subject to our machloikis, but let's go with the side that even though the Torah says She'eroi, but we say that's an asmachta, that's the way we paskin. In other words, a Baal Yarshins, his wife, Midrabanan. So what would be even in a Yerusha Midrabanan? So the Gemara answers that will even be effective. we are learning. So in the Gemara, as does the Pnei Moshe, all right? Look inside the Pnei Moshe, the third line from the top of the Amid. Shafila v'yarshim she'en l'davar Torah k'goyin shemachar le'isha. V'habal hu yirish ra'isa. The ein yirish ra'si elam edivreim. Because the drashas l'she'era is only an asmachta ba'alma, as we learned in Perek Yishlei Chalin. So the Gemara is answering that this will also be effective even by Yorshim that are only midrabban. Okay, now back to the Brais. Shehiu kol hamaisve shali kol zman shulafanav. So Nachamal, you have a kohen. Kohen is selling the field to a Yisrael. When the kohen owned the land, he kept all the trumas u'maisves. He separated and he kept it. He doesn't want the buyer will have to give it anyways. So the kohen, the owner, tells the buyer, all the futures are mine. It's effective. Ki'ilu amar, I have an ownership in the land. Now he's telling him, shehiu kol hamaisve shali, only kol zman shehulafanav, only as long as you, the buyer, are in possession of the land. Saying clearly. So then, he limited the kohen, the original owner, right? Won't have it forever. Only yiu hamaisve shaloi, only kol zman shehulafanav, which would mean, chevra, that if the buyer, the Yisrael, a day later, a month later, a year later, 100 years later, whatever, machra la'acher, the moment the buyer sold it to someone else. So here again, when you own something, you sell what you own. Here, we're saying that the fact that the original kohen only retained those rights, kol zman shehulafanav, so the original kohen, I no longer have any rights. So if the buyer sold it la'acher, then from then onwards, ein loy b'maisros. So then the new buyer, right, the kohen sold it to Reuven sold it to Shimon. Now that the field is in the hands of Shimon, the kohen has no such rights. But hold on, now comes the question. What happens if Shimon sold it back to Reuven? Here we're going to have a machlokes. Now, chazar v'lakcha mimenu. What happens if Reuven bought it back? The field is again before the buyer. So we have a machlokes between a braisa taught by Rabbi and another braisa taught by Rabbi Oishia. Generally, the braisas are from Rabbi and Rabbi Oishia, but here sometimes each one had a different version. So it's a machlokes Amoraim, the first generation Amoraim, but it's really each one quoting another Tan. So Tan and Rabbi ein loy b'maisves. Ein loy b'maisves is because once the sada leaves the buyer's hands, its connection to the kohen, its connection to the seller is permanently severed. And how can you get it back? Why? There was no new kinyan. However, Tana Rabbi Shaya or Rabbi Shia, however you pronounce it, he had another girsa. Yesh lo b'maisres. I want to say like this. If the ownership that the kohen would have in the land for the maisres would have been a normal type of ownership, which it's not, because if it would have been a normal type of ownership, it would have automatically gone down in Yerusha. Look at the irony. When you own something, when you have something in your hand and you no longer own it, no one would say you get it back. Like, what's the logic of the Braisa of Rabbi Shaya? How would you get the maisres back? Because if your connection to something, this is the paradox, is very weak, it's very good in this case. Something that's strong can be severed. When the connection is very subtle, you can argue that subtlety continues forever. But let me use these words. You know when you can let go of something? When you have it in your hand. If you don't have something in your hand, you can't let go of it. Since the ownership of the kohen in the land is so weak, ironically, dafke because of it, it wasn't let go just because, when Reuven sold the field to Shimon, it's not the fun of, no one is saying that the Braisa says. When the first buyer sold it to the second buyer, the kohen has nothing. Question is, what happens when it comes back?
Are you saying that because because the ownership of the Kohen is so like minute, it's that it doesn't actually weigh up, that it doesn't actually change like the new owner's like ownership. Like it doesn't really make such a difference to it. But you're saying if it was too strong,
something that's more solid, ironically, can be severed easier. Something that's weaker, something that's more subtle.
Physically, like
I'm talking about halachically.
Okay.
No, I'm not talking about a rope.
What did that mean? This when
Shimon sells it back to Reuven.
When Shimon first sells it to Reuven, shouldn't he also have a hold on it when Reuven owns it?
No, because let's forget the names. The Kohen sold it to Reuven and Reuven sold it to Shimon. Since when the Kohen sold it to Reuven, he told him that Almanas, that I have the Mises, Kolzman, when it's under your ownership, so he can never claim it from Shimon because it's not under Reuven's ownership. But now Reuven bought it back. So Rabbi Chia makes sense. Okay, once he sold it, it's severed. Moshe says, no, it's not severed. He doesn't get it. But if the original owner buys it back, now it's the fun of, he gets it. So now the Gemara is going to say, and this is the mission that we quoted in our words of introduction. Look at this Gavaldik. That Asyan Ilan Piloi Gavasa, Ki Ilan Piloi Gavasa. This machloikas between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shia is going to be now related to, we're going to make a bridge to the following machloikas that we have in Masechtas Ksubas. And again, let's repeat the case. What's the case of Masechtas Ksubas? The Tanin on Tamon. This is a Mishnah in Ksubas. Again, a man marries a woman. When he married her, let me tell you the specific case. He writes her a Ksuba. Let's say she was a Ba'ula. It doesn't make a difference. She was married already before. I'm giving that example for a reason. So the Iker Ksuba, the basic Ksuba, is 100 zuz. Now, that woman who was married, Reuven is marrying Sarah. Sarah was already married before. From her previous marriage, she had a daughter. It wasn't uncommon, as we learn in Masechta Ksubas, that when a woman is coming into a marriage with specifically daughters whom she was more concerned about, who will support them until when they get married, she's telling her new husband to be, I'm marrying you, but you have to take upon yourself to support them, even though you're not obligated to support them because they're my daughter. And he agreed to it. And that would be one of the additions that one can add in the ksuba. So there's a Tosefes ksuba. And he wrote that your sons, your daughters, by the way, it can go to the sons as well. That's just the norm. Women were not that concerned with their sons. Their sons can go and work. Daughters then, women didn't work as they work today. That was the Tanai. So Reuven agreed in the ksuba, not only to the basics, which are chayiv to, but that he will support Sarah's daughter until when she gets married. Reuven marries Sarah, and he divorces Sarah. He right away remarries her. I'm saying right away because normally when a man divorces a woman, then he would pay her a ksuba. When a man would pay his ex-wife the ksuba, he would get the ksuba and he would rip it up. He never came to paying the ksuba. He remarried her. When he remarried her, he felt there's no need to rewrite the ksuba because we have the original ksuba. And he, by the way, he's right because the marriage is based on the ksuba. So says the Mishnah. What's not clear is that, of course, the first ksuba is going to be used for the second marriage. Maybe only the ikir ksuba. Is it only the ikir or is it also the tosefes? And this divorced her and remarried her. Does the original contract go back in its entirety, or only basics is going to be linked to the machlokes between Tanei Rabbi Chia and Tanei Rabbi Shai? Let's read it inside. Today in Talmud we learned over there in Ksubas, Shamagadash Isha and the Hechazirani remarries her when he's allowed. If she marries another man in between, he's not allowed. But if she did not marry another man, like we said, Amram remarried your Chevet. And Almenas. So first of all, even if nothing was spoken, they didn't write a ksuba, doesn't matter. If there is a ksuba, then almenas ksubasa harishoina echazedon. By the way, there's another side to what I'm saying. The other side is that let's say if he divorces her, she cannot get two ksubas. That's another detail. We're not going to focus on that detail over here. Yeah, when he divorces her, if he'll divorce her the second time, he's only chayiv one ksuba. Now, what is the question? So now says the Gemara that Tana Rab Chanan Kumei Rabbi law, which is Rabbi law today in Amoirayim, that you should know that there are two Amoirayim that argue regarding the detail that we just spoke about, which is the Tosefes Ksuba. Chad Amar, one says that when the Mishnah says that it's almanas, the second marriage is based on the first ksuba. We extend the first ksuba into the second marriage. That's only the ksuba, meaning to the basic ksuba, to the, let's say in this case that I gave, she was a bula, but she had a daughter, to the 100 zuz, which would be what he would have to write if they would write a second ksuba. Now, by the way, not every ksuba has tanoim, but that will be in the case where the word tanoim. But the other one says no, that when the Mishnah says that the second marriage is based on the first ksuba, it goes back to the way the first ksuba was. Bein l'ksuba, bein l'tanoim. And now the Gemara verbalizes which side goes with which side. Man the Amar, which was the first of the two Amarinoim, that even though the Mishnah says that it's almanas the first ksuba, it only means ksuba v'loy l'tanoim. I know there are different girsois, and the Pnei Moshe somehow makes it make sense with the words yeshloi, but that's very complicated, and we're going to leave it to the way we have the girsa in the brackets, the way we have it at the Shinu Nuschayis, the way the Marafulda has the girsa. Ein loy b'maisrois. Coming back over here makes sense, right? It goes together. You understand? In other words, when he divorced her, even though the ksuba is going to go back, but not the details, the ksuba is going to go back because when a man marries a woman, there has to be a ksuba. That's a given. But those stipulations, when he divorced her, they ended. How would they be reenacted? He divorced her, that commitment was severed. Once the commitment is severed, how do you resurrect it? You can't. Same thing over here. He made a tanai, the kohen made a tanai to Reuven, to the first purchaser. When you have it, I'm getting it. He sold it to Shimon, dead, ge'endik. How can you resurrect it? But a man, the Amar, that no, doesn't work that way. That bein l'ksuba, bein l'tanoim, then that would fit. That was the chiddush of the Tanit that Rabbi Ishaya, that yesh lo b'maisros. What we are really saying, a man gave a wife a get. If he didn't pay her out to ksuba yet, then the commitment that he made prior to the first marriage is still there, even though he divorced. And now that he remarried her, chayzer v'neir.
Comparing a marriage to a sale. Get this krisos, nechira. You always make it tonight, shalom. So as long as the condition is fulfilled, as long as it's the fun of, it's not krisos.
First of all, you're saying good, but one second. The ksuba is not don't use the word krisus when it comes to ksuba, because a man is chayiv to pay the wife the ksuba after the get. Go further. In other words, the krisus of the get not only didn't end the ksuba, it triggered the chiyuv of the ksuba. So it's in the opposite direction. Let's go back. Okay, says the Gemara. Now, according to Rabbi, that he made a tanai. The tanai was lefanov. The moment Reuven sold it to Shimon, geendik nigmar hatanai. And even if Reuven gets it back, Reuven is not chayiv to give to the original kohen. Okay, says the Gemara about Tanim. We learned in a brayso, kibel soda mikoyhenes, that if a man was mekabel a soda from a koyhenes. Now this is really a brayso based on the Mishnah we're going to have on Daf Nun Ches. Just to repeat that, halacha beis was when a Yisrael, when a kohen was what was halacha beis? Halacha beis was when the owner, the
owner was Yisrael and the kohen was the sharecropper.
Thank you. And now we're going in the opposite direction. That when you have a Yisrael, that's a sharecropper, and the owner is a kohen, the Mishnah is going to say in next daf as a given that it's self-understood that the Mekabel is going to give the Trumas Omaisros to the owner. Without them even verbalizing it, that's that we understand, because the Yisrael has to give anyways, give it to the owner. Now, the Braisa, first of all, says that it makes no difference whether the owner is male or female. Same thing would be that if Kibel Sadam Mikoyanas, if the Yisrael is the sharecropper from the owner, so not only does the owner share remain to the owner, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, in other words, because the owner is a kohenes, but the maisris that the mekabel has to give automatically also belongs to the kohen, and the Braisa says the same thing will be if she's female. Shalom. Okay, Akan is what's negate to tomorrow's share. But now the Braisa continues. What happens if this kohenes, same concept, marries a Yisrael, and the din is, my friends, that a kohenes, while married to a Yisrael, no longer is eligible to eat truma. So even though the mekabel is chayiv to give it to the owner during this time that she's married, right? He's not chayiv to give it to her anymore. So the non-spoken binding agreement that the Yisrael has to give it to the owner was severed. She married a Yisrael, and therefore cholkin the maisvus. Everyone does what they want with their share. But now, says the Braisa, it's very similar to our case. She reverted back to being someone who's eligible to eating truma. Either she became a widow or she got divorced. Then the Braisa says chazra l'tchilasa. So l'choyda, what do you see over here? That even though a certain stipulation was severed, it's not permanently severed. It can be chayze v'neya. That's the Gemara's kash. But you're thinking the Gemara is going to write. The Gemara is going to actually write two differences, slowly. Number one, says the Gemara, no. By the way, before number one and number two, I just want to make it clear that Rab Chia was Tani Rab Chia. At the end of the day, if you need to, Rab Chia can say, Yechaba Braisa. You're asking on me. We're trying to minimize the machlokes and Braisas. That's what this is. So answer number one is, Khan, meaning the case of Rab Chia. Who was the seller? Who was the mekabel? The kohen was the one that sold it. In other words, the kohen is the one that the seller was the one that needed to make the effort to retain, which he did. But he himself limited himself. He says, I'm retaining it only when it is lefanav, you, Reuven, the buyer. After it's lefanav, it goes back to what normally when you make a sale, the sale is everything. Over here, Shekibel, what's the difference? I'll tell you very simple. When the kohen sold the field, he has no ownership in it. Elama, we saying there's a certain type of ownership in the land, but that ended when Reuven sold it to Shimon. So he had no shaykhus to the field. So how can you resurrect something based on what? There was no kesher. Over here, don't forget the kohenes that went there, got married, they got divorced. She always owns the land. She never lost her ownership. That's the simplest answer. Elama, while she is married, the Yisrael doesn't have to give it to her, the mekabel. Kan shekibel. In other words, since the land never left her possession, this is Gamaldik. That's why, even according to the Tanit Rab Chia, when her marriage ends, that privilege comes back because she always owns the land. Turning to Daf Nun Zayin Amid Beis. The Gemara is not happy with this answer. The Gemara, no. For Tanit Rab Chia, problem is that even though we had our girsa of the Braisa that we just learned on Daf Nun Zayin in the bottom, which is behemshich to the Mishnah Halacha Gimel. The Mishnah Halacha Gimel is speaking about a Yisrael that's mekabel from a kohen, so the Braisa is just speaking about a Yisrael mekabel from a kohenes. Rab Chia learned the same Braisa by Machron. Same thing. That if a kohen sold the field to a Yisrael, there's a Braisa that holds that it's a given that she retains an ownership in the land for her to always receive the trumos and continue. That's a different Braisa. It's the same concept, but it's by Mechira. And then the Braisa says if she gets married to a Yisrael, then the buyer doesn't have to give anything to the original owner. But then if she gets divorced, now you got a problem. You can't answer the differences is because she always retained some sort of connection of ownership. It's not only by Mekabel, it's also by Mechira. So that answer won't work. And still the Gemara will give an answer. I'll tell you the difference. Tamon Yotzos Midishus Shneyem. The kohen was the original owner. Right? The case that we began today's share with. Sold it to the Reuven. When the Reuven sold it to Shimon, not the original, nor the buyer. Mamish It's biyat shlishi. That's why it's severed permanently. Masha'enkein bram hache, even according to the girsa of the Braisa of Rabbi. Again, that we're speaking about a case where a kohenes sold her land. So by default, she retains ownership enough to get the trumos in the future. And now this kohenes got married, but it's still in the hand of the person to whom she sold it to and retain those rights. So it's easier to resurrect it. You're right that Yatzas Mirishus Meichen, but for Yatzas Mirishus Lekeya. Really, Alam Gemara here. Okay. In yeshiva, you would go and you would argue and you would show you can think differently, but that's the way you got to think. And that nuance of it, huh?
He would agree that if the Yisrael then sold the field and then bought it back, that Bivadai, the rights would not go back to the Kohenes. Because then it left both their possessions.
Correct.
And that would
correct. I'm still gonna. All of this is based on this unique type of ownership. Okay, right.
Why is the Genesis first year? So why is the right to the Genesis when Mike says goes on? She's married. Have the Yisrael.
That's not the case over here.
But what I'm trying to say is that the ability to be grateful shouldn't have an effect on the Bibles.
Yes, but no. Which is, since the Kohenes, in the case of Makabel, never told the Yisrael Almanas, it's mine. She didn't say that there. It's a halachic assumption that people understand that since the Makabel has to give and the owner benefits by eating, so therefore they made that agreement. The moment she can't eat, no such an agreement. When you make an explicit stipulation, you'll still be many cases. A Yisrael will get truma. There's value to the truma, even when Yisrael cannot eat. Let's go. Now, says the Braisa, Koyin Shemachar Sadali Yisrael. And again, the same case that we began today with. V'amaloi, not that forever. Almanas, sheyu ha'maisles, shaloi. The word shaloi means to me, to the original owner, to the Koyin, but not period. He had it for 4 or 5 years. So you would think that he limited his rights. He's only retaining it, so he has limited rights. Versus the case we began today's share with, it's mine forever, not for his kids. Actually, by limiting his rights, he has more rights. Wapshad, he has more rights. The person who bought the field, if he would plant, let's say, grain, there's no dinim of arla. There's no dinim of neted avoid. Could the buyer plant a vineyard in the field? Why not? Because arla and neted avoid, even if he said 5 years, he wants to retain something for his benefit. As I write, there's a paradox. If he wouldn't have said 4 or 5 years, la'olam, so the buyer can say, I want to change, I want to make it into a vineyard. You need to wait for until the 5th year. Say it forever. When you limit something in the limited time, you have more power. People know they only live until 120, they have more power. And people have the delusion that they're going to live forever. Everything is weak. Yeah, now I'll do it next time. So now the original Kohen can protest. This is Gavaldik. You don't have the right because you're taking away. I retained 4 or 5 years. You're ruining. And even though the Chiddush is, even when he said 5 years, doesn't matter. Just Arle eats up Roiv. Or he can stop him. Isotis. Isotis is a plant that's primarily used for a dye, D-Y-E, not D-I-E, dye, a paint. And we already learned that something that's not oichel is exempt from trumas u'maisros. So you're getting out. Or shalei lasri said they kanim. Reeds also. Reeds are not food. They can be used for construction. They can be used for musical instruments. They're not food. Now 1 second. What happens if a person were to say, the Kohen says, Almanas, the maisros are mine, period. The guy is allowed to plant reeds. What's the logic? Because at some point in the future, I'm going to plant food. I don't even know when. Maybe in 30 years. So what? Well, now says the Braisa. In contrast, like we spoke out, that if the Kohen says Shali, lo Shali, which is the case of the beginning of today's share, then it means lo oilam, even though it doesn't mean to the Yarshim, but it means his, and therefore, any Yachalim Chaz B'yadei Shali the Kedem. Nor can he make a macha. He cannot protest by saying Shaloi Lozoyre Isatis. Nor can he protest by saying Shaloi Lasoy Sedei Kanim. Because in some time in the future, the Yisrael, the buyer will tell him, at some point in the future, you're going to get exactly what you want. Says the Gemara story. Also, Uvda, Kumiramacha Barula. In other words, this Shaila actually came. The Kohen, this goes on the Sefer, guys. The Kohen made the stipulation, Shali Lo'olam. And the buyer decided to plant whatever, the dye. And the Kohen took him to a Rav. And Rabbi Acha Bar Ula did not agree with his price. V'chayve mitanle chad min ashterei de konaya. He planted the reeds. And he obligated him to give him something which normally you're not chayv. You don't have to give trumos. You don't have to give maisres from reeds. Whatever the coin was going to get, he got over here. Some the word of one of 10. 1 of 10 is meiser. So just a couple of things over here. Like how much would you think he should get? No. Takonas Ezra is something else. But I'm saying even before Takonas Ezra, you're coming in late over here, is that a kohen can always keep for himself the meiserishin even before Takonas Ezra. Ezra says you can give it to the Levium, and the machloek is forever, for temporary. The kohen is retaining it. The kohen gets truma, 2%. From what remains, 10%. How much is that? Right? Be'erech 12, not exactly. And not only that, then you have the meiser, and meiser he also keeps. He keeps all of it. He said 10, so to make a point, which is interesting. Because it's only a knas. He benefited something. He got his reeds, and he didn't have to give 12%. Doesn't matter. But the fact is that we're just pointing out that Rabbi Acha Bar Ula did not accept the psak of the Brais. So amachloikas. Now, whether he was an Amoira, which I think he was, how is he able to do that? Mistama, he needed to have another Brais to back him up. But the Gemara just wants to let you know, I don't know the Brais, but a Maisa Shahoya Kachai. Now let's go back. Let's see if we can make it into the mission. If you have a Yisrael Shemachar Koyin, suddenly Koyin, the other direction, a Yisrael sold the field to a Koyin. Guys, one thing I want to make it clear. Don't confuse this with the case on Daf Nun Hey that we learned twice this week, Daf Nun Hey. Don't confuse it with the case of Kablanus. We already spoke out that there's an issue of something that looks like Koyin HaMeseyah Bebeis HaGronos. This is not a Kablan. This is different. A sale, right? Retaining ownership rights. So the Yisrael sold land to a Kohen, and the Yisrael told the Kohen, Amanashi or Maisle Shaloi. Shaloi means of the Yisrael for 4 or 5 years. And Michal, that's to your point. In other words, I know he's a Yisrael, but he's saying, I want it to be mine. So he'll get the right to give it to whoever he wants. Okay. But here, you know when he's allowed to do so? Only if it's for a limited amount of time. We never had this nuance before. First of all, like, he should be allowed to do it. He can retain the ownership in the lands, but there's another problem. He's a Yisrael. You can't have a scenario where he's making himself into a kohen. The Eibishter said to a Yisrael, give the matnas kohuna to Kaihanim, even though the rich, here, not the irony, the owner will be a kohen, and he's going to forever give it to a Yisrael. No, it's like a rabbinic problem. He made himself into a kohen. For 4 or 5 years, it's okay, but lo'olam asur. Look inside the Pnei Moshe, 4 lines from the bottom, all the way in the big lines. Right? Muter the Rishaya Yisrael lahasnis imay al kama shanim. No, it's not 4 or 5 medio. Sheyu amais the shaloi. Now he's a Yisrael. He can't eat it. I know he can't eat it, but for who yit name lemisha yitz. Avlo mamaloishi amais the shaloi lo'olam. But to make a stipulation, which we learned today, the opposite direction would work wonderfully. that the new buyer, the Yisrael, will have to give it to the original owner, the seller, kohen, but not over here. Also, why? She'ein kohen oisa kohen achet. The Zajac kamoi she'oisa laha Yisrael kohen. He's making himself into, it's not correct. Beautiful. But look inside the Braisa. She'ein kohen oisa kohen. Now, 1 second. Now, let's go in the opposite direction. Kohen shumachasad Yisrael, the opposite. And here again, we never had this case. What did we learn today, Simcha? That the kohen is selling it to a Yisrael, and he's telling the buyer, which would make sense, almanas, that I get the trumos. Look at this stipulation. The kohen is selling it to the Yisrael. Now, let's go 2 steps. Can the kohen retain the rights of the truma for himself? He could. Can a kohen gift truma to a Yisrael? Yeah, again, the Yisrael can't eat it. So he's saying, Almanah sheyu ha'maaseh shelcha. How great is that? So the din is, says the Braisa, even though it's only for 4 or 5 years, even that is already awesome. Why? I get it that forever for a kohen to give, I know it's not giving, that will be the difference. You cannot make Israel into a kohen. But temporary, we don't have that issue. So if you don't have that issue, why would this not be allowed? That's the Gemara wants to know. Why would it be also? Let's go until the Mishnah. Says the Gemara Daf Nun Ches. Why is that? In the other direction, where the buyer is a kohen and the kohen is going to be giving to the Yisrael, it's going to be okay. So why is it not okay over here? So the Gemara gives a Gavaldic answer. That kan ziko b'davar shu b'reshusay. As long as it's not on a permanent basis, who is giving it to the Yisrael in the Reisha? Who is giving it to him? The kohen. The kohen owns it. I can give something that I own. What would be the case in the Sefer? He's going to keep it for himself. Gavaldik. No kohen is giving it. He doesn't have the right to give it. He's a Yisrael. In other words, in this last case, the kohen sold the field. And I know that I said that if the kohen sells the field, you would think, since he could retain the ownership for himself, so then the Yisrael will have to give him the trumos. That is okay. So since he has the right to get it, he can gift it. But that's not what happened. What happened is that the Yisrael ends up keeping it. The Yisrael can never end up keeping it. Because he doesn't own it for him to give it. That's why even for 4 or 5 years, it won't be.